1,200 warships closed around Earth on a Thursday morning. The largest blockade in galactic history. Nothing in, nothing out. The conquered expected humanity to break within 90 days. Earth's response arrived in 6 hours. One sentence transmitted on an open civilian channel. It was not a surrender. It was not a plea. It was a business notice. Effective immediately, all agricultural exports from Earth are suspended pending resolution. Admiral Cresvarin laughed when he read it. 6 weeks later, 4 of the 12 species in his armada had food riots. 9 weeks later, he was on trial. The conquered was the galaxy's governing alliance, hundreds of species, 12 of them with battle fleets circling Earth. They expected surrender within 90 days. What they failed to understand was that humanity's power didn't come from warships. It came from soil, rain, and a biosphere unmatched in known space. Most civilizations lived on hydroponic proteins. Earth produced surplus. By the time the blockade began, every major species in the fleet was dependent on human grain shipments. The export suspension was not a desperate move. It was the activation of a strategy decades in the making. The woman who designed it called it the long lunch. And her story is where our documentary begins. Elizabeth Vance was not a soldier. She never commanded a fleet or fired a weapon in anger. She was a trade economist from a farming family in the American Midwest, raised on corn, soybeans, and the certainty that whoever controls the food controls the future. When she became Earth's trade secretary at age 52, her confirmation hearing lasted 11 minutes. Nobody considered the position strategic. The galaxy had warships and energy weapons. What could a woman who understood grain futures possibly matter? To answer that question, you have to understand what Earth has that almost nowhere else in known space possesses. Most habitable worlds evolved life, yes, but they evolved it in equilibrium. Their biospheres are fragile, balanced, slow. Drop a foreign microbe into the soil of Delos 4, and the entire nitrogen cycle collapses within a season. Attempt large-scale monoculture on the Kesvarn homeworld and the native fungi retaliate, consuming your crops from the roots up. The galaxy's civilizations eat because they learned over millennia to synthesize protein in vats, to extract calories from engineered yeast, to import what they cannot grow. They are fed, but they are not full. Earth is different. Earth is violent. Earth's continents have been bombarded by asteroids, drowned in ice ages, scorched by volcanic eruptions, and yet every time the planet erupted with life again. The soil of the Midwestern plains contains more microbial diversity in a single teaspoon than exists in the entire crust of a typical garden world. That soil does not merely support crops. It attacks. It devours dead matter, breaks down toxins, cycles nutrients at a speed that agronomists on other worlds cannot believe. The result is surplus. Glorious, staggering, impossible surplus. Elizabeth Vance understood this from childhood. She also understood something darker. Surplus creates dependency, and dependency is leverage. 112 years before the blockade, Earth joined the galactic market. At first, nobody paid attention. Terran grain was abundant and notably extremely cheap. Suspiciously cheap. The price of a metric ton of human wheat delivered to the core worlds was approximately 40% below the cost of production for any local equivalent. This made no economic sense. Alien trade analysts assumed humans were either subsidizing their exports or were simply bad at math. Both explanations were wrong. Internal documents declassified after the blockade reveal the truth. The policy was deliberate. Elizabeth Vance's predecessor, a man named Arthur Chen, wrote the original memo in the year 2171. He called the strategy artificial vulnerability cultivation. The idea was simple. Flood the market with grain priced below production value. Make human agriculture the default calorie source for as many species as possible. Allow their domestic food industries to wither. Let them become dependent. Then wait. Vance took over the program 38 years later and gave it a more memorable name. In her first internal memo, distributed only to the highest levels of Earth's unified government, she wrote, "We are inviting them to a long lunch. The first course is cheap. The second course is necessary. And when the check arrives, we will own the table." The long lunch became official state policy, unrecorded in any public treaty and invisible to every trade monitor in the Concord. For 112 years, Earth quietly, patiently, strategically fed the galaxy into dependency. By the year of the blockade, the numbers were staggering. Earth supplied 31% of all caloric trade across conquered space. For some species, the dependency was much higher. The Veth, a species of 9-foot insectoids with a cultural taboo against consuming anything grown under artificial light, imported 72% of their food from Earth. The Delosians, despite living on what should have been a fertile world, had so thoroughly mismanaged their biosphere that they relied on human grain for 55% of their staple carbohydrates. The Kesvarn homeworld, ironically, imported 61% of its processed food from the same species they now had warships encircling. The Conquered, however, did not audit these numbers. Neither did Admiral Cresvarin. Cresvarin was a military commander, not an economist. He rose through the ranks of the conquered fleet by winning battles, not by understanding supply chains. When the treaty dispute erupted, over Earth's refusal to submit its defense forces to centralized conquered command, Cresvarin was handed command of the blockade not because he was diplomatic, but because he was aggressive. The conquered wanted Earth to see strength. They believed a show of overwhelming force would produce a quick capitulation. On March 4th, at 7:30 in the morning Earth Standard Time, 1,207 conquered warships assumed positions in high orbit. The formation was visible from the surface, a ring of amber and red light stretching across the sky like a wound. Communications were jammed on all military frequencies. Civilian channels were left open, a deliberate choice. The conquered wanted Earth to broadcast its fear. They wanted the footage of a panicked population to soften the human government's resolve. The fear did not come. Instead, at 1:45 that afternoon, a message went out on a public trade advisory channel. It was addressed to all conquered member states currently receiving agricultural shipments from Earth. It was 114 words long. The essential content was a single sentence: all exports are suspended until further notice. The long lunch was over. Now it was time to clear the plates. Admiral Cresvarin, upon hearing the message, laughed audibly on his flagship bridge. His executive officer later testified that he called it the emptiest threat in the history of interstellar conflict. He ordered his fleet to hold position and sent a message to Concord's Central Command predicting human surrender within 30 days. The prediction was optimistic. He gave them 90 days in his official report, just to be safe. Nobody in the Admiral's war room thought to check the agricultural import statistics. Nobody asked how the Veth homeworld would feed its population if human grain stopped arriving. Nobody calculated the caloric deficit that would hit the Kesvarn civilian sector within 5 weeks of a total supply disruption. Nobody considered that the Human Trade Secretary had been preparing for this exact moment for her entire career. And so, as the conquered fleet sat in orbit, bristling with weapons and armor, the real battle was already taking place far below them. It was happening in grain silos, shipping manifests, and the empty cargo bays of thousands of freighters that had been quietly recalled to port the moment negotiations began breaking down 6 months earlier. Elizabeth Vance had seen the blockade coming before the admiral who ordered it. She had prepared. She had positioned assets. She had stockpiled what needed to be stockpiled and emptied what needed to be emptied. The only question remaining was how long it would take for the conquered to realize that they were not starving Earth. They were starving themselves, And that is where the true disaster begins. The first 5 days were quiet. Admiral Cresvarin maintained fleet discipline, broadcast regular demands for surrender, and ignored the civilian trade channel as beneath his attention. On the surface, Earth's governments issued calm statements about ongoing negotiations. Grain silos remained full. Freighters stayed docked. And across the galaxy, the first shipments failed to arrive. On the Veth homeworld, a planet of 19 billion insectoid citizens, the daily caloric intake was 72% human-sourced. The Veth do not stockpile food. Their culture views hoarding as a profound spiritual failure, a lack of faith in the abundance of the universe. They had no strategic reserves. When the weekly grain convoy from Earth failed to appear at the Arcturus transfer station, the Veth trade minister issued a polite inquiry. The response was a form letter, all shipments suspended pending resolution of the blockade. The form letter included a link to the Human Trade Secretary's public notice. The Veth minister, named Kelthanes, opened the link, read the notice, and immediately understood something that Admiral Cresvarin had not. This was not a negotiation tactic. This was a countdown. On day 12, Kelthanes sent an encrypted message directly to Concord's Central Command. The message was blunt. The Veth homeworld had enough food in transit and in local markets to last approximately 32 days before rationing would become necessary. After 60 days, the government would lose the ability to maintain civil order. After 90 days, the death toll would begin. Please advise. The message was forwarded to Admiral Cresvarin, who marked it as low priority and returned to reviewing fleet formations. He still believed the humans were bluffing. They were not bluffing. On day 17, human intelligence intercepted a separate communication from the Delosian Agricultural Consortium. The Delosians had attempted to source grain from alternative suppliers. They had contacted the Jorath Combine, the Threxian Trade League, the independent farming colonies of the Halo Reach. The answers were all the same. No one had spare capacity. Earth had so thoroughly dominated the export market for over a century that the galaxy's agricultural infrastructure had atrophied. The farms that could have competed with human grain had been abandoned generations ago. The shipping networks that could have moved alternative supplies had been dismantled or repurposed. The knowledge of how to produce food at scale, in soil, under open sky, had been lost to most species entirely. They had become, as Elizabeth Vance had intended, incapable of feeding themselves. The Delosian Consortium drafted a formal protest to the Concord demanding that the blockade be lifted on humanitarian grounds. They quoted Article 17 of the Concord Charter, which prohibits the use of essential resources as weapons of coercion. The irony was not lost on human observers. The Concord had blockaded Earth to coerce treaty compliance. Now they were accusing Earth of weaponizing food. The legal absurdity was almost beautiful. On day 23, Elizabeth Vance gave a press conference. It lasted 12 minutes and contained exactly one quote that would be reprinted, analyzed, and debated for decades afterward. A reporter asked whether Earth was intentionally starving the conquered member states. Vance looked directly into the camera and said, "We are not starving anyone. We are simply no longer feeding them. There is a difference. The blockade is a conquered operation. The Concord has 1,200 warships in our sky. If the Concord's own members are going hungry, perhaps the Concord should ask itself what those warships are actually protecting." Then she walked out. No follow-up questions were taken. The clip spread through every news network in known space. On the Kesvarn homeworld, a planet that had blockaded Earth with 37 of its own destroyers, the civilian population watched their government's own warships being used as the justification for their hunger. The backlash was immediate. Within 48 hours, the Kesvarn ruling council faced its largest public protests in 300 years. The protesters carried signs with Vance's quote translated into Kesvarn script. The words did not soften in translation. If anything, they grew sharper. By day 30, the Veth were on strict rationing. Kelthanes sent a second message to Concord's Central Command. This one was not polite. He pointed out that the Veth had contributed 11 warships to the blockade fleet, that Veth sailors were serving under Cresvarin's command, and that their families were now standing in food lines. He requested immediate permission to withdraw Veth forces from the fleet and open independent negotiations with Earth. The request was denied. Concord regulations did not permit individual members to break from a unified military operation without the consent of the commanding admiral. Cresvarin withheld that consent. He viewed it as a matter of military discipline. He believed that allowing any defections would collapse the entire operation. He was correct about the collapse. He was wrong about what would cause it. On day 34, the Veth made a decision that changed the strategic calculus of the entire conflict. They went around the admiral. Using emergency powers under the Concord's own humanitarian protocols, the Veth civilian government issued a direct appeal to Earth for a bilateral food agreement. The appeal was transmitted publicly, on every diplomatic channel, and it was explicitly addressed to Trade Secretary Elizabeth Vance. The message ended with a phrase that no Concord member had ever used in an official communication with a non-member species. "We request terms." Vance responded within 2 hours. Her reply was not a negotiation. It was a statement of conditions. The Veth would withdraw all military personnel from the blockade fleet. They would issue a public statement acknowledging that Earth's export suspension was a lawful response to an act of aggression. And they would agree to a new bilateral trade framework, negotiated directly with Earth, outside the Concord's authority. In exchange, Earth would resume shipments at a priority rate. The offer was open for 48 hours. After that, the Veth would be treated as a hostile party, and their access to human agricultural exports would require full Concord surrender as a precondition. The Veth Council debated for 11 hours. Then they voted. The margin was not close. 12 of the 14 ruling matriarchs voted to accept. The 2 dissenters argued that the terms amounted to treason against the Concord. The majority argued that feeding 19 billion people was a higher duty than fleet solidarity. The first crack in the blockade had appeared. Admiral Cresvarin was informed of the Veth decision by a junior communications officer. According to bridge logs later entered into evidence, his response was a single sentence: "Then we will stop them." He ordered a detachment of 12 Concord warships to intercept any civilian freighters attempting to reach the Veth homeworld. The order was technically within his authority but strategically catastrophic. He had just escalated a trade dispute into an active blockade of food shipments to a member species. The Concord's own ships were now preventing Concord citizens from being fed. That was when the second crack appeared. The Kesvarn, already dealing with street protests, received intelligence of the Veth's defection and the Admiral's interdiction order. Their council reconvened in emergency session. 2 members of the ruling body had relatives serving on Kesvarn destroyers in the blockade fleet. They argued that their people were being used as shields against their own survival. The Kesvarn defense minister, a veteran commander named Grekthal, issued a direct order to all Kesvarn naval vessels to break formation and return to their home system. It was not a request. It was not a negotiation. It was a recall order with the force of law. 37 Kesvarn warships powered down their weapons, disengaged from the blockade perimeter, and went home. The blockade that had numbered 1,207 vessels was now 1,207-48. The number was still large. The symbolism was larger. On day 41, a third species broke ranks. The Delosians, who had been paralyzed by political infighting, finally reached consensus. Their agricultural sector was on the verge of collapse. Their reliance on human grain for 55% of their staple carbohydrates meant that every day of the blockade was pushing their population closer to widespread hunger. The Delosian ambassador to the conquered appeared on a live broadcast and announced that Delos IV would be entering direct negotiations with Earth immediately. The ambassador added a line that Elizabeth Vance would later describe as the moment I knew we had won. He said, "We cannot eat warships." By day 45, the food riots began, not on the blockaded worlds but on the homeworlds of the blockading species. On the Veth homeworld, despite the diplomatic breakthrough, supply lines had not yet resumed. The riots were not violent by Veth standards. Their culture has no tradition of physical confrontation, but they were massive. Millions of citizens stood silently in public squares, refusing to work, refusing to return home, until their government guaranteed food delivery. The image of an entire species simply stopping, standing still, waiting to either be fed or to die where they stood was broadcast across every network. The Concord's propaganda apparatus tried to suppress the footage. They failed. In a galaxy of instant communication, silence is impossible. Admiral Cress Varon, aboard his flagship, was now facing a strategic situation that no Concord commander had ever confronted. His blockade was still in place. His ships were still armed. And yet his position was disintegrating from the inside. The species he was supposedly protecting were abandoning him or turning against him. His own subordinates were questioning his judgment. And on the planet below, Elizabeth Vance was watching the collapse unfold on her personal monitor, one defection at a time, one panicked diplomatic message at a time, one quiet step toward the inevitable conclusion. But there was one factor that nobody, not even Vance, had fully anticipated. The long lunch had a final course. The dependency that Earth had cultivated for over a century was not limited to food. It extended to everything that makes food possible: fertilizers, soil treatments, the proprietary microbial cultures that kept the grain yields at levels no other world could match. The Delosians, desperate to restart their own agriculture, discovered that their soil had been dependent on Earth-sourced biological amendments for so long that without them, their crop yields would be a fraction of what they needed. They could buy grain from Earth, but they could not grow their own. The dependency was deeper than anyone had calculated. The trap was not just closed. It was structural. It was permanent. And as the fifth week of the blockade gave way to the sixth, the conquered leaders began to understand a terrifying truth. Even if they lifted the blockade tomorrow, they could not undo what 100 years of cheap human grain had done to their civilizations. The realization cascaded through the conquered's remaining leadership like a structural failure spreading through a compromised hull. On the Delosian homeworld, emergency agricultural teams confirmed what the data had been suggesting for weeks. Their soil had lost the ability to cycle nitrogen without the human-engineered bacterial cultures that had been part of every grain shipment for 80 years. The cultures were proprietary. They were not sold separately. They came embedded in the grain itself, their spores clinging to the husks, activating upon contact with Delosian soil. And they expired. Without fresh applications every growing cycle, the soil reverted to its native state, which was, by Delosian standards, dead. The dependency was not just economic, it was biological, it was engineered, and it was, as the Delosian agricultural minister wrote in a confidential memo that leaked within hours, the most sophisticated trap in the history of interstellar relations. The memo leak on day 48 transformed the political landscape entirely. The conquered had blockaded Earth to force treaty compliance over defense forces. That was the public story. The private story, now spreading from terminal to terminal across the galaxy, was that the conquered had accidentally exposed the fact that its entire civilization was being held together by cheap human grain and invisible human science. The outrage was not directed at Earth. It was directed at the conquered leadership that had blundered into a crisis without understanding what they were blockading. The memes that circulated on civilian networks were brutal. One, widely shared, showed Admiral Cresvarin's flagship with the caption, "He thought he was starving them. He was starving us. He still doesn't know why." Another showed Elizabeth Vance's face alongside the quote, "We are simply no longer feeding them," with the words "warning, adult in charge" beneath it. By day 51, the fourth species broke. The Threxian Trade League, a loose coalition of merchant worlds that had contributed 21 vessels to the blockade, announced that they were withdrawing from the operation and had already reached a preliminary food agreement with Earth. The terms were not disclosed, but the Threxian ambassador gave a brief statement that contained a phrase that would echo through the final weeks of the crisis. "We joined this blockade expecting a siege. We did not join expecting to become the besieged." Admiral Cresvarin was now commanding a fleet that had shrunk from 1,207 vessels to 831. Nearly 400 ships had been recalled, withdrawn, or had simply left formation without authorization. The remaining 800 crews were restive. Messages from home were filled with news of food lines, rising prices, and public anger. Sailors serving under conquered colors were watching their own families go hungry while their admiral ordered them to hold position around a planet that was, by all visible evidence, doing fine. Earth's night side still glowed with city lights. Its agricultural dreadnoughts sat dark and silent in orbit, their cargo bays sealed, their running lights the only sign of activity. The symbolism was not subtle. On day 56, Cresvarin convened a meeting of his senior command staff. The transcript of that meeting, entered into evidence at his later trial, reveals a commander in the grip of a catastrophic strategic failure. He proposed, in direct terms, escalating the blockade into a military assault on Earth's orbital cargo infrastructure. His argument was that if the human grain was the source of their leverage, destroying the freighters and the agricultural stations would remove that leverage. His executive officer, a veteran of 22 years named Selanthes, asked a question that the transcript records in the exact words she spoke. "And then what do our people eat, Admiral, after we destroy the food? Do we all starve on principle?" Cresvarin did not answer. The transcript notes a silence of 48 seconds before he dismissed the meeting. That night, Selanthes sent an encrypted message to Conquered Central Command. She informed them that the Admiral was contemplating a course of action that would, in her professional assessment, constitute a war crime under Convention 17 of the Concord Charter, the prohibition on the destruction of essential civilian resources. She requested that the Admiral be relieved of command pending psychological evaluation. The request was forwarded to the Concord Security Council, which had, by this point, been in continuous emergency session for 3 days. The Security Council was a body of 15 members, representing the most powerful species in the Concord. 4 of those species had already defected from the blockade and were negotiating directly with Earth. 3 more were in the process of doing so. The remaining 8 were split. 4 wanted to negotiate a face-saving compromise. 4 wanted to escalate. The admiral who had been sent to force a quick surrender had instead forced a constitutional crisis. On day 58, the Human Trade Secretary's office released a document to the press. It was not a policy statement. It was not a negotiation offer. It was a historical record. It was the internal memo that Elizabeth Vance had written upon taking office, the one in which she had named the strategy the Long Lunch. The document was damning not because it revealed the strategy, but because it revealed the timeline. Vance had written the memo 38 years before the blockade. She had predicted in specific terms that a blockade or embargo would one day be used against Earth, and she had laid out the exact countermeasures that would be activated in response. The document had been sitting in a government archive, classified but not deleted, for nearly 4 decades. The release was accompanied by a brief statement from Vance. "We told ourselves what we would do if this day ever came. We hoped it would not. We prepared as if it would. The Concord chose to test our preparation. The results are now a matter of public record." The effect on Concord morale was devastating. The blockade was not being defeated by a military countermove. It was being defeated by a plan that had been written before most of the sailors in the fleet had been born. The humans had not improvised. They had not gotten lucky. They had waited. By day 62, the food riots were no longer contained to the Veth homeworld. The Kesvarn, the Delosians, the Threxians, and now 3 additional species, their names less familiar but their suffering identical, faced widespread civil unrest. The Concord's own internal security forces were being deployed not against external threats, but against their own hungry populations. The irony was complete. The galaxy's greatest military alliance, commanding a fleet capable of obliterating planetary surfaces, was being undone by empty stomachs. And then, on day 68, the truth that would eventually put Admiral Cresvarin on trial came fully into the light. An investigative journalist on the Concord's Central News Network obtained a set of documents that had been deliberately buried by Concord's Central Command. The documents showed that a full agricultural dependency audit had been conducted 6 years before the blockade. The audit had been commissioned by the Concord's own Trade Monitoring Division. It had concluded in unambiguous language that a blockade of Earth would trigger catastrophic food supply disruption across every major Concord member within 30 to 60 days. The report had been submitted to the Security Council. It had been read by the Concord's highest civilian authority. It had been suppressed. When the report became public, the narrative of the blockade shattered completely. The Concord leadership had known. They had launched the operation anyway. They had sacrificed their own population's food security for a treaty dispute that, by the terms of the report itself, they knew they could not win through military means. The person who had not known was Admiral Cresvarin. He had been given a fleet and a mission without being told that the target of the blockade was the sole supplier of food for 31% of the galaxy's calories. He had been set up to fail. And now, as his fleet dwindled and his authority collapsed, he was being positioned to take the blame. On day 70, the Security Council voted to relieve Cresvarin of command. The vote was 11-3, with 1 abstention. The order was transmitted directly to the flagship, bypassing the Admiral's communication staff. Selanthes, the executive officer who had questioned the Admiral's judgment, was ordered to assume command and immediately begin de-escalation procedures. Cresvarin was arrested by his own crew under the authority of the Concord Charter's provisions for command incompetence in a humanitarian crisis. The arrest was recorded by the bridge security system and inevitably leaked. The footage shows a tall, rigidly disciplined officer being escorted from his own command deck by 2 junior crew members. He does not resist. He does not speak. The expression on his face, according to the psychologist who later evaluated him for trial, was not anger or fear. It was confusion. He had, to that moment, never understood what had happened to his blockade. The fleet began to stand down. De-escalation protocols were initiated. And on Earth, Elizabeth Vance received a direct communication from the Concord Security Council, the first official contact since the blockade began. The message was 1 sentence. "We are prepared to discuss terms." The long lunch was over. The check was on the table. And now, as the Concord faced the consequences of a century of cheap grain, the question was no longer whether they would pay it. The question was what the price would be, and whether they could afford to ever eat without human permission again. The negotiations took 11 days. They were held on a neutral station in orbit around Proxima Centauri, chosen because it was close enough to Earth for convenience but technically outside conquered jurisdiction. Elizabeth Vance led the human delegation. Across the table sat the remaining members of the conquered Security Council, those who had not already broken ranks to negotiate separately. The first day was spent establishing protocol. The next 9 days were spent dismantling the conquered's power structure, clause by clause. Earth did not demand reparations. Vance was too smart for that. Reparations create resentment, and resentment leads to future wars. Instead, she demanded structural reform. The conquered's centralized military command would be dissolved and replaced with a voluntary mutual defense pact, one that Earth would not join but would agree to supply. The Security Council would be expanded to include human representation, with veto power over any blockade, embargo, or military action taken within 50 light-years of Earth's sovereign space. And all existing trade agreements would be renegotiated bilaterally, species to species, with Earth as the primary agricultural supplier at rates that would now reflect the true cost of production. The cheap grain was over. The era of permanent dependency had a price tag, and every species at the table knew they had no choice but to pay it. The agreement was signed on the 11th day. The blockade formally ended 12 hours later. The remaining conquered warships, those that had not already withdrawn or been recalled, powered down their weapons and began the long journey home. The ring of amber lights that had circled Earth for 72 days dissolved into scattered points, then vanished. Humanity had not fired a single shot. And yet every government in the galaxy understood, with absolute clarity, that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Admiral Cresvarin's trial began 3 weeks after the fleet's withdrawal. He was charged not with war crimes, because no shots had been fired, but with criminal negligence and willful disregard for civilian welfare. The prosecution's case rested on 2 documents. The first was the suppressed agricultural dependency audit, which proved that conquered leadership had known the blockade would cause a food crisis. The second was Cresvarin's own command log, which showed that he had been warned repeatedly by his executive officer and by the Veth trade minister, and had dismissed those warnings as irrelevant to military operations. The trial was broadcast live across every network. On the 4th day, Elizabeth Vance was called to testify. She entered the courtroom in the same simple gray suit she had worn for the press conference that had broken the blockade's narrative. The prosecution asked her a single question: had the conquered surrender terms been consistent with what Earth would have accepted before the blockade began? She answered without hesitation. Before the blockade, we would have accepted a seat at the table and fair pricing. After the blockade, we demanded structural change. The difference is the cost of a lesson the conquered should not have needed to learn. On cross-examination, Cresvarin's defense counsel, a young Delosian attorney who had taken the case against the advice of every colleague, asked Vance whether she felt any responsibility for the suffering caused by the food suspension. The question hung in the air for a full 10 seconds. Vance's reply was not defensive. I feel responsibility every day. I felt it when we drafted the contingency. I felt it when we activated the suspension. I felt it when I saw the footage of the food riots on the Veth homeworld. But I also know that if we had surrendered to the blockade, if we had allowed the conquered to dictate terms by force, the precedent would have been set for every future conflict. The galaxy would have learned that blockading Earth works, and that lesson would have cost far more lives over time than the one we taught instead. So yes, I feel responsibility. I also feel that we made the right choice. Both things are true. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Cresvarin was sentenced not to prison, but to permanent exile on a small, self-sustaining station in orbit around a dead star, with no communication privileges and no right of return. The sentence was widely criticized as too lenient by the populations that had suffered, and as too harsh by the military traditionalists who believed he had been made a scapegoat. Both criticisms were probably correct. The admiral's final statement, recorded before his transport departed, was 10 words. "I was never told what we were actually blockading." He was not lying. That was the tragedy of it. With the trial concluded and the new trade agreements in place, food shipments resumed. The first freighter to reach the Veth homeworld was met by a crowd of over 1 million citizens, standing in silent vigil as it descended through the atmosphere. The image of that ship, a massive human agricultural transport painted in the blue and green colors of Earth, became the defining visual of the crisis's end. It was reprinted on posters, projected on buildings, and eventually carved into a monument in the central plaza of the Veth capital. The inscription beneath it read, "We were hungry. They fed us. We will not forget that we could not feed ourselves." But the true cost of the long lunch was still being calculated. As human grain flowed back into the galactic market, the dependent species confronted a reality that the blockade had laid bare but could not undo. Their agricultural sectors were not merely underdeveloped. They were, in many cases, non-existent. The soil treatments, the microbial cultures, the proprietary biological amendments that made their worlds capable of producing food, all of it came from Earth. The Delosians, who had attempted to restart their own farms during the crisis, had watched their crops wither in the native soil. The yields were less than 10% of what they achieved with Earth-sourced amendments. They could survive on human imports indefinitely. They could not survive without them. The dependency was not temporary. It was permanent. It was, in Elizabeth Vance's original phrasing, the final course of the meal. What happened next broke into the news cycle without warning. 6 months after the blockade ended, a team of independent xenobiologists on the Kesvarn homeworld published a paper that should have been unremarkable. They had been studying the microbial cultures that came embedded in human grain shipments, the same cultures that had been part of the supply chain for over a century. The paper's title was technical and dry. Its conclusion was anything but. The human microbes, the paper stated, contained a dormant genetic sequence that did nothing under normal agricultural conditions. But if exposed to specific stress triggers, atmospheric contaminants, certain chemical signatures consistent with weapons discharge, or the introduction of non-terrestrial biological agents, the sequence would activate. The microbes would shift from beneficial symbionts to aggressively competitive pathogens, releasing enzymes that broke down the cell walls of native flora, disrupted nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and within a single growing season, would render the host planet's biosphere incapable of supporting native plant life. The paper was initially dismissed as alarmist. Then the humans confirmed it. In a press release that was notable for its lack of apology, Earth's Agricultural Security Division acknowledged the existence of what it called biospheric safeguards, embedded in all exported grain since the very first shipment more than a century earlier. The official name of the protocol was Quiet Night. The unofficial description, provided by an unnamed government scientist in a background interview, was simpler. If anyone ever tried to burn our fields, their fields would die too. The galaxy's collective understanding of what had happened during the blockade shifted one final time. The conquered had not merely been outmaneuvered economically. The blockade fleet had been sitting in orbit around a planet that possessed the capability, buried invisibly in the very food it exported, to destroy the biosphere of every species represented in that fleet. The weapon had never been used. It had never even been threatened. Elizabeth Vance had chosen to suspend exports, to let hunger and public pressure do the work, rather than activate a contingency that would have ended billions of lives. The long lunch, it turned out, was the merciful option. The alternative, quiet night, was a genocide. Admiral Cresvarin in his exile was never told about Quiet Night. He died 20 years later, still believing he had been defeated by a grain embargo. The rest of the galaxy now knew better. Humanity had not simply fed the galaxy. Humanity had colonized it, one grain shipment at a time, with a weapon that would never fire as long as the galaxy remained a friend. And as the revelation settled, one question echoed through every diplomatic channel, every news broadcast, every private conversation across 100 worlds. If the food contained a failsafe, what else might contain one? The microbes that purified their water, the bacteria that treated their medical waste, the engineered organisms that helped them produce their own technologies. For over a century, Earth had been quietly integrating its biology into every layer of galactic civilization. The dependency was not just caloric, it was systemic, it was total, and it had been designed that way from the beginning. The check for the long lunch, it seemed, would never stop being paid. The question that haunted galactic policy circles for decades afterward was not whether Earth had won. That was indisputable. But whether humanity had planned Quiet Night from the beginning, or whether it was a contingency that evolved into something darker over the century. Declassified documents released years later offered no clear answer. The original long lunch memos made no mention of biospheric failsafes. The Quiet Night Protocol first appeared in internal records 31 years before the blockade, a full generation after the cheap grain strategy began. This suggested a gradual escalation. The dependency was the plan. The failsafe was an insurance policy added later, perhaps when someone inside Earth's security apparatus realized how completely the galaxy had been compromised and decided to ensure that if humanity ever fell, everyone else would fall harder. The ethical questions remain unresolved. Was Elizabeth Vance a visionary who prevented a war and created a stable, if asymmetric, peace? Or was she the architect of a quiet tyranny, a system in which the galaxy's freedom existed only at the pleasure of a single species? The answer depends on who you ask. On the Veth homeworld, where the memory of the food riots fades with each generation, she is remembered as a necessary force, a leader who used hard power wisely and without massacre. On the Kesvarn homeworld, where the Quiet Night revelation landed like a bomb, the view is more complicated. A popular Kesvarn novel published 12 years after the blockade, titled The Poison in the Grain, portrays Vance as a sympathetic monster, a woman who fed the galaxy because she loved it and armed its food because she feared it. The book won literary awards on a dozen worlds. It was banned on Earth for 6 years before being quietly unbanned without explanation. The real Elizabeth Vance retired from public life 5 years after the blockade ended. She gave one final interview to a human journalist she had known since childhood, in which she was asked the question everyone wanted answered. Did she regret the dependency she had created? Her answer was characteristically precise. Regret is for things you would undo. I would not undo what we did. The galaxy was always going to find a reason to fear us or attack us or try to control us. Better that they need us instead. Need is a more reliable foundation than fear. Fear fades, hunger does not. She died at the age of 87 on the same farm in the American Midwest where she was born. Her gravestone bears a single line of text taken from her first internal memo about the long lunch. They came to the table hungry. They left fed. The price was the table itself. The blockade of Earth lasted 72 days. The quiet war that preceded it lasted a century. The peace that followed, uneasy and asymmetrical, and built on a foundation of invisible threads stretching from Earth's soil to every world in the galaxy, will last as long as humanity chooses to maintain it. And if that ever changes, the galaxy will discover, too late, that the food was never just food. If you want to understand how power actually works, not the power of armies and weapons, but the power of systems, of patience, of the invisible leverage that turns enemies into clients and blockades into negotiations, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We release a new documentary every week. The next one is about a company that sold water to a desert world and ended up owning the entire planetary government without ever firing a shot. You will not want to miss it.